Good evening. Welcome to the first of the Landscape Urbanism lecture series. These are a series of lectures we organize every year from Landscape Urbanism, where we bring both practitioners or theoreticians that in a way are pushing the boundaries of what we consider to be landscape urbanism, whether it is from the side of the landscape designers, urbanists. So this year we have 4 of these lectures in the first term. So this first lecture, we thought about bringing Eelco Hooftman, who is the founding partner of GROSS Max. Eelco is a sort of long-term in a way partner, or sort of a person we have invited in several occasions as external examiners for landscape urbanism. He's somehow knowledgeable of the field. He is one of the, I would say, leading landscape architects in the United Kingdom. They define themselves as a combination, or actually as having a certain combination of British sense of humor, a Dutch sense of experiment, and a German sense of rigour. It is definitely true. GROSS Max has a certain, well, a very conceptually driven and quite strong definition for their projects. They are definitely capable of fabricating an intriguing imagery where they experiment with landscape, with ecology, with concepts of culture to come up with always surprising and telling, I would say, products and projects. In London, if you feel the need later, you can actually walk, and quite a substantial part of South Bank is, or the walk between the GLA and South Bank is designed by GROSS Max, with the area around the Royal Festival Hall, areas around the GLA. So also GROSS Max and Eelco in particular have a certain rigor in the way in which they approach projects which are located in cities, a rigor in which the way they approach the problem of the urban and definitions of urban problems, always looking from the prism or the view of landscape architecture, and in the way the cultural aspect of landscape architecture. So I will, in a way, give now the word to Eelco Hooftman.
Right, thanks for introducing me. Now I only have to show you the pictures. It's quite nice to be here in the Temple of Architecture, you know. I have to say, we have this love-hate relationship with architects, you know. Architects with the kind of towering egos and the kind of big utopian aspiration, don't we know all about it? And here we are, we landscape architects. Slightly more down to earth, slightly more relaxed, slightly more thinking about space, time as a process of slow transformation. I like this picture of Europe by satellite at night. It's first of all, we don't see any political boundaries, but it's also fascinating that the whole of Europe is becoming one urban constellation. And the urban fabric, that's exactly the field of our operation, that's our territory. It's quite different when I was educated as a landscape architect in the Netherlands in the 1980s. At that time it was all about rural land use and creating land out of the sea, and we hardly even addressed the topic of the city. But interesting enough, in my own class, my classmate was Adriaan Geuze, West 8, myself and some of our fellows in that generation, we started to discover cities as much more interesting topics. So yes, landscape architecture is about close observation, it's about framing, it's about zooming in, it's about zooming out, of trying to understand the territory. I like this picture very much of Ruysdael. It's an old Dutch landscape painting by Ruysdael. I like it because of the, of course, of the flatness of the land. You know, I like flat. I also like the idea that town and countryside already at this time was interwoven. You don't really see the transition. The landscape itself, the countryside, is already industrialized. The bleaching of the linen. You see the rigor of the geometry. Also interesting is, of course, the punctuation of the horizon with those churches, and especially the big one in the center. And I show you the next slide, and this is a painting by Sarandam inside that church. Of course, a beautiful Protestant Calvinistic church. It's all about space, light, asymmetric composition. Also nice, the movable furniture, the little doggy and the child. It's all kind of from a human perspective. But architecture is, of course, display with light. And the third painting is looking towards that church, standing on the market square next to the town hall. So here we have the town hall, the civic politicians, we have the market, the economy, and we have the church, religion. And all of that, of course, that makes the kind of civic nature of the space. And the reason I show you this kind of sequence, because for me it's the kind of field of operation of our profession. It goes from land to scape to architecture. And I quite like to break down, I don't like the word landscape urbanism, by the way, I can be upfront about that, but I quite like to break down the word landscape architecture in those three components. Another one of my Dutch heroes, Vermeer. And what's intriguing about the paintings by Vermeer is that you always see this kind of, or very often, the map of the Netherlands as background of his paintings. It's like a secret code, which is, of course, very interesting because it shows Holland already as a sense of a topic, or as a project, as an enterprise. And you only have to kind of update that picture. And it's kind of intriguing because the Dutch are beavering away, making land out of the sea. This is still an ongoing project. It's fantastic to see the transformation in between the two slides. And if you look, say, for example, of this picture of Amsterdam, then it's intriguing to see is that the countryside is actually more geometric and more rigorous as the city itself. So this is a completely man-made construct already from the very early age. There is even, you could analyze that even the Dutch sense of democracy comes out of this combined effort of trying to keep the land dry and protected from the sea. You need to have a kind of organized political system in which everybody takes a part. It's not a country of big land ownerships like we see in the United Kingdom. And this is the current state of my home country, this kind of total work of art, this completely man-made construct, where each square centimeter is being planned, is being discussed, and being reshuffled. The kind of duration of a landscape in the Netherlands is on average 20 years, and then you start all over again and make a new layout. And of course, the Dutch sense of experiment leads to this strange conceptual way of expressing. Funny enough, you need a German to tell the truth about the Dutch. And as you know, you got good Germans and bad Germans. This one is a good one. It's Joseph Beuys, the artist. And I really like what he said about the Dutch landscape. Basically, he said about the Dutch landscape that we fucked it up big time. We reclaimed so much land from the sea that we lost the liquid mirror. So this kind of bouncing of the light, this very atmospheric condition, which created exactly those landscape paintings of the Golden Age. We lost that reflective quality because of this land reclamation. And because of that, according to Joseph Beuys, the Dutch have nothing to add any longer. They don't produce any work of visual art of any quality. So it's kind of intriguing that the making of the land creates a kind of the sense of the aesthetics development. So here we are, this kind of straitjacket functional landscape, which literally this landscape was my territory. I was responsible for as a strategic landscape architect before I came into exile into Scotland about this type of landscape. And this is actually what I was dreaming of, the idea of that landscape also could be sublime, that landscape could be an aesthetic experiment, that landscape could be about emotions and deeper subconscious feelings. So I kind of literally escaped the Netherlands and went to live in Scotland. And that's where GROSS is founded and the place from which we operate. And the early days of our little office, we didn't have any work, and that was fantastic. I only can dream of the days we didn't have any work. So you have time to read and to write manifestos. And this is one of the very early manifestos in which we try to position ourselves into the realm of this landscape style, not the English landscape of the last century. We go all the way back to the 17th and 18th century, which we believe landscape really was in this country a field of aesthetic experiment. We call it the art of the artifact, the cult of the cultivar, a landscape of dandies, hermits. And really on top, if you read the newspapers in those days, like the Spectator, they were on the front page, fierce debate on landscape and landscape projects. We think that kind of sensitivity is lost in the 20th century, and landscape was not longer landscape, but became translated with the word environment, and something which was very sensitive and precious and delicate was replaced by what we call this kind of green tissue of a monstrous green blanket. Some other observations. I think landscape architecture is one of those professions, and maybe landscape urbanism try to do that in its own right, which can reconcile opposite forces. So as a landscape architects, on one hand, we are very interested in, say, for example, Bacchus on the left and Apollo on the right. It's Bacchus for us stands for hedonism, heat of the moment, being extrovert, and Apollo stands for rigour, structure, architecture, organization. And we believe landscape architecture can reconcile those opposite forces in one and every project. And for us, it's a kind of interesting way of looking at it. Yes, we believe as a landscape architect, we often talk about the landscape in layers and unraveling the layers, not unlike a seductive art of a striptease. And as a landscape architect, you should be seductive as Mata Hari and as shrewd as Miss Marple. So another two of our heroes. And look at that hat on the right. If I only could design a hat like that, I would be the highlight of my career. You don't need landscape urbanism to do that. So landscape is a strange thing, which of course got an incredible long way. It all goes back, of course, since we are a band from paradise. It's the longing for the lost paradise which creeps into this profession of landscape. And on the left, on the right for you, it's of all places, it's Munich, the English Garden in Munich. So this very conservative German city, and give the citizens a piece of greenery, and look what they do. They will completely go wild and mad, and turning into this kind of natural instinct again. Another observation is that landscape is this big spectrum. On one hand, the wilderness, nature. The other hand, the hardcore cities. At the same time, we are actually more interested in what those two slides, both pictures are by my friend Thomas Struss, the German photographer. But what I like about it is not so much what they differ, but what they have in common. You could look to a piece of wilderness as an urban jungle. The same kind of process of transformation and juxtaposition and a growth towards light. And if you see the Thomas Struss photograph of then even in seeing the buildings as an architect, you should be able to see the different ages and time frames of this building. So it's a continuous crop rotations of buildings in which cities are, of course, part of a process which is not unlike the succession you see in nature itself. Often we use terminology from ecology and superimpose it on urbanism. So we like the idea that you've got a pioneer vegetation which occupies wasteland, and over time this pioneer vegetation becomes climax vegetation as a process in ecology. We think the same count for cities, so you can talk about pioneer urbanization and a transformation until you reach climax urbanization states. I really like this painting. In fact, I'm very envious about it. I wish I had painted it myself. I only discovered this painting last year, but it's one of the paintings of the American Hudson School of Painting, about 1850. And what I like about it is that simultaneously we see the foreground and we see the background. So we see the close-up of the flower, all those botanical details, and we see the background of the wider landscape horizon. And that kind of in between the wide panorama and the close-up is very tempting. Of course, it's also very sensual painting. I don't have to tell you about the hummingbird bird and the orchid, and it's talk again about this process of seduction. In fact, the whole idea about nature for me is a process of seduction. So this is an image we made more than 10 years ago, but I just show it in that correlation. It looks like a kind of inspiration in retrospect. In this, I show you a couple of our images first before I detail some more build projects or design projects. But for us, landscape architecture is about intensification. It's about intensifying the outdoor space. And for us, the idea is there's too much lookalike in the outdoor environment. It's like mixing all kind of colors. You end up with a kind of grain brown slurry. So we believe it's more important to kind of make accentuation. And sometimes it means we are shouting and it's extrovert. Sometimes it's the opposite. We are whispering and we're very introvert. But it's the idea of creating more intensified experiences as a journey through space and time. In order to do so, we do a lot of competitions. This is a competition we luckily lost because it was the Princess Diana Memorial Fountain. This became a bit of a saga for the winners. But we actually lost because we put Prince Charles as a little silky boy in a pink shirt in the background. And it's amazingly that every time especially in landscape, you hit this kind of British establishment, which you have to fight. On a smaller scale, the projects are often installations, and in this case we like to work with artists. This is a proposal for a vertical garden in the center of London with the American artist Mark Dion, fantastic artist. One of his theories is not survival of the fittest, but survival of the cutest. If you don't know him, you have to look him up. He's a great guy. So the idea of landscape as an installation, in this case, is kind of vertical, layered ecology on a kind of piece of very small territory. A lot of the work we do is, as I said, is the urban landscape, is defining the public realms. A lot of those landscapes are quite architectural. They often don't have any green in them. It's just about the hard landscape of the environment. Of course, where we really get loose is parks. We like the idea of the park as an ongoing field of experiment for the landscape architect. This is a competition. We won second prize in Germany for the Gleisdreieck, a really intriguing site on the former boundary between east and west, and abandoned railway yards, which nature has taken over the years. The project itself is a combination of a woodland, a meadow, and experimental gardens, so quite simple ingredients. And on one hand, it celebrates the city on its periphery and nature in its core. By definition, a lot of the work we do is collaboration with architects. That's why I said that we love them and we hate them. A lot we do is with Zaha Hadid Architects. Since about the last 10 years, we do most of the landscape works if they require the services of the landscape architects. There's always a fight with Zaha herself because he doesn't like trees. She's a force of nature herself, of course. What we like about her work is, of course, that her work is an abstraction of natural process. So the idea of stratification, the idea of geological processes, built in a kind of abstraction, we found very tempting, especially if the buildings are coming out of the ground in terms of in its horizontal as kind of folding of the terrain. Like many other architects, I think Zaha is struggling more if she tries to design towers. They tend to become more banal. this is an example of where we had a breakthrough in the British establishment, where we were asked to design a master plan for Kew Gardens, which is an ongoing project. Although we're a very small project, I think we won this commission on a very simple statement that if we would get a job, our project would be about opening up the gardens towards River Thames. So that would allow not only to reflect on the history of the gardens, but to use this kind of dynamic ecosystems of the wetlands to reconcile the global agenda to the local territory. So bridging the gap between the aspirations to promote biodiversity around the globe, but also do it in your own backyard. And over the years, we have become more and more romantic. I kind of had a slow process of detoxification from starting as a modernist and ending up as a romantic. So my career goes backwards in history. There is no progress there. Some of the work, of course, it's the contribution to exhibitions and manifestos. This is a manifesto we wrote for this fantastic utopian Cumbernauld new town in Scotland. And this is a project called Global Warming, Local Freezing, in which we propose a nuclear-powered iceberg to support counter-attacking global warming on a local scale. Of course, it's a bit like a fridge. If you try to cool something down, you actually generate heat, and the surplus heat is pumped in this quarry, which is a limestone quarry, which you got this beautiful light blue water. So it's a bit like the Blue Lagoon in Iceland. So you got this climate interchange. And funny enough, if you look to the real site of this outside Dunbar in Scotland, then you see that the landscape is actually molded by the forces of the ice age. But on the same locations, you can find fossils in the rock, which shows that the same beach has also been a tropical landscape at one stage. So the whole transformation from tropical landscape to the ice age on this one location is what fascinates us. So we always said, don't worry about climate change. You just get worried if there is no climate change. You know, the climate is always changing. And we like it because, you know, that's the reason why we go on holidays in the first place, you know, change of climate. It's fantastic to see that the city of Berlin got the biggest outdoor tropical swimming pool, and Dubai got this indoor ski slope. You know, you always want to do what you don't have, so it's a change of climate. It's a good thing. So we started off with the installations. We're going increasing in skill with the regional planning studies for mining areas in Germany. Limited competition for the ring, the medieval fortifications around the city of Leiden as a new linear park. Studies of big parks. This is in Chengdu in China, a park of 800 hectares built around a new extended lake. It's part of one of those crazy new town developments. Proposals for a new town in Doha outside in the city of Lusail. Closer to home, and I must say it's a frustration for me as a landscape architect being educated in the Netherlands, is that actually we would like to do things big. We want to tackle a big scale, but we have little opportunities to do so. This was interesting, however, was a commission by Design for London to make a strategy for quite a big chunk of London, what we call the Acadian landscape. It's the River Thames between Chiswick House, downtown Hampton Court, but also extending in Richmond Park and Wimbledon Green, etc. So we made a strategy for this wider area. If we work on those strategies, we often like to work with two aspects. On one hand, we're very much interested in time and the process of transformation. So we always try to look to what are the kind of elements in the landscape which are very slow changing. You know, these are the evergreens. This is all to do with geology and bedrock. It's to do with cultural landscape. It's to do with ecological values. You know, these needs time to develop. They need to be, strengthened to create them into networks. if you do so, we believe you create a strong framework which also allow a place for transformation. So then there are other elements of the same strategy which concentrate on areas which are catalysts for transformation. So we're working with, where are the ruptures in time and where are the kind of slow-moving wheels. So it's two time frames simultaneously operating in one landscape. So yes, we like to look at cities as pieces of urbanized landscape. And of course, London, with all its parks and the river, is intriguing. What also is intriguing is that if you want to find a geology map of any city or a soul map of any city, you go for hard times. They hardly ever exist. But we are really keen to understand those layers. What's the abiotic layer, the kind of layer in any city, which is the non-living material, geology, hydrology, geomorphology. That's the kind of bedrock on which you build cities. That's also, if you can express that, it's how you can read cities. A very good example is Manhattan in New York. In downtown and uptown, on the places where you got the highest bedrock, you got the highest towers. So the skyline of Manhattan is a direct translation of the geological substrate. So these kind of things we are very much interested in. At the same time, we like maps like this. This is a very old map, although it looks very trendy. It's Sir Abercrombie, The Greatest City Plan of London. It's designed in 1944 to kind of see how London could be redesigned with the prediction that the war would end. But what I like about this map of London is that the whole city looks like an organism. The whole city is kind of designed like this kind of cells which operate, with each cell got its own core. Of course, we know London is based on a agglomerate of villages, and all together they're making this urban organism, this urban beast. So in that sense, we are interested also in ecology, the kind of the ideas of contemporary ecology as a metaphor, and maybe more than a metaphor, maybe also as a source of inspiration of how to plan cities in a more dynamic, interactive way, breaking away from the Cartesian city, to think more about cities as dynamic networks. And this is, of course, some of our other heroes, the Situationist and people like Constant in the 1960s. And then, of course, the experiments of Zaha and her team about a different way of a more organic and a more free-flowing urbanism which breaks away from that Cartesian grid. Again, sometimes I'm critical as well that some of this urbanism becomes so abstract that some of the other things I talked about as the natural substrate it's kind of underexposed, but at the same time we're fascinated about this new way of defining the territory based on more dynamic principles. One of my other heroes is, of course, Darwin. I just put it in because last week I was giving a talk in a symposium which was called Survival of the Fittest. So we had to go back to the origin, Charles Darwin. And I show you one of his projects, which I found fascinating, and it's not well written about, it's not well known. And one of my people in my office, they especially went there on a kind of expedition. And this is an old expedition, and the guy in the foreground is Joseph Hooker, which was for a long time the curator of Kew Gardens in the 19th century. And he had a good working relationship with Darwin, which was kind of interesting because they were working on the idea of Darwin long before it was being published. And Darwin was quite hesitant to publish it because of the effect it would create, that man, would be the result of a survival of the fittest ecological process. But they did a combined project on the Ascension Islands. This is a small rocky outcrop exactly between Africa and South America. And when Darwin and Hooker were there on the island, this was just one barren rock. It was just bare, no vegetation. And what Darwin together with Hooker did, it was exporting plants from other islands, from all different places, a kind of mismatch of greenery, and put it on the top of the highest peak on this island. in order to capture the clouds. And by capturing the clouds, they would cause rain to fall on the island, and they collected that in a beautiful pond, a dew pond. And because of capturing the water, the island suddenly could become a strategic role in the British Empire as a kind of outpost in between, going in between the colonies and the discoveries of new land. So it's a fantastic example. I cannot give you a better example of the last century of where clever ideas of biology, ecology, leads to a fantastic intervention. And I like it very much because it gives me, the biggest fight I have in my professional life is fighting what I call the ecological Taliban. I have to do it on a daily basis. The guys who want to conserve, they want to keep the things the way they are, they want to use only native plants, etc. And we are very much interested in the idea that you could actually create nature, that nature is a man-made product. And this is a beautiful little but poetic example of that. So yes, we believe in research, the idea, of how to, and of course, I was asked to talk about research behind the work, but the reality is we don't have time to do research behind the work. We just, like maniacs, go from one project to another. But I also do teaching, and I use in the teaching and my studios in teaching to do research, which then maybe filters back in our products. And for the last years I'm teaching at the GSD in Harvard, which we do all kind of experiments. Last year we revisited Central Park for a really in-depth study, but also to do new interventions. And this year we're doing the opposite. We're studying the Lake of Walden, where Thoreau wrote his famous book called Walden, and it became the origin of the American environmental movement. Another strange thing, this is a weird one, I have to warn you, this is a strange one, but for me landscape architecture is about zooming in, zooming out. It's sometimes I call ourselves the children of the Google Earth revolution. And I'm intrigued about the idea that, especially in the history of landscape profession, also that was taking place, and that landscape always was its territory with trying to find our place on Earth and even into the celestial world. And last year we were asked to do a small intervention, or at least as part of an invited competition in the gardens of Versailles. And when we were studying the gardens, we came across something intriguing. Now, of course, we all know those gardens. It's got this big axis as a kind of pompous way of defining the garden of the king. Of course, Louis XIV was called the Sun King, so the garden is full of references to Apollo, and the sun comes up in the east, it goes down in the west, and the tract is across this composition. It's all a lot of metaphors and things like that. And intriguing, and I checked that, but again, this is well known, but I checked it for my own to see that. If you are in the bedroom of the Sun King, you are in the center of the axis. So imagine laying in bed, with your legs spread out, arms spread like a Vitruvian man. You're sitting, bang right in the center of your own composition. So that's, nice for a wet dream or some ego trip. So that's all the case. But the thing I want to talk about is slightly more intriguing, and I show you this as a little experiment, because we extended the axis of the gardens accurate with Google Earth, with all the right alignments, no fooling around, no nothing. And we did this kind of global enterprise, and believe it or not, we ended up, and this is serious, this is intriguing, in Tempelhof, Jerusalem. Now, if this is true, and I showed this at the ETH in Zurich, in which I have a fierce debate at the moment with the scholars about the Baroque garden, because if this is true, you can rewrite some chapters of the history books of landscape architecture. If it's not true, which the big professors say it cannot be true, it's even more intriguing, because the coincidence is also very sweet and actually even more beautiful. You signed the Treaty of Versailles and all this history, and being exactly in this very symbolic axe, and this axis mundi linking the Sun King Apollo with the real God in what used to be the center of the world. So either this is a fantastic ego trip of Louis XIV, or it's a sheer coincidence. either way, an intriguing story. I'm writing a publication on that right now. Right, now a bit more of our projects. I show you our best projects in the first place, so you can go home to the pub early, call it a day. It's a very ecological sound project, because we didn't do anything. We didn't make any drawings. We also didn't have any clients, so it was all very low key. In fact, we didn't do anything. It's around the corner where I live. Most people think I'm an urban rat, that I live somewhere in a gutter. It's not true. I'm not stupid. I live in the countryside. Let it be said. But this is the project, those cubes in this sand dune landscape, coastal landscape. And it's of course nearly like a piece of land art, this line, this undulating line of those Cartesian cubes. But of course this is a collaboration between German and Britain in the Second World War. This is trying to keep the Germans out of landing in Scotland. But what I like about this project is that on top of those Cartesian blocks of warfare, you got those spontaneous gardens. They are there, and again, I repeat, we didn't do it, we just recorded and made it our manifesto product. I presented this project in Vienna a while ago, and they didn't got it. They keep on asking, and now those were landscape architects, I have to admit, they keep on asking, how did you do it? What is your planting plan? What is your maintenance? But girl, we didn't do anything, They got Freud, they got Wittgenstein, and they still don't get it. Intriguing. So we found this interesting, that on top of this Cartesian block of warfare, you got this spontaneous, fragile gardens, and it's a beautiful, and it is this kind of idea that the gardens, they nearly look like Chinese rock gardens or Japanese Zen gardens. And it's a little, pedestal of nature. So nature is a force in its own right. It's even able to, break up this kind of Cartesian blocks of warfare. So we like this idea of this spontaneity about the natural occurrence. And some of the best projects in our profession are literally based on not doing anything at all. And look at this. I mean, I saw on the list Peter Eisman gives a lecture in a couple of weeks' time here in the same series. Ask him about the Jewish memorial. He can find it in my back garden. And it's the other golden rule in landscape: everything is done before. Yes, we are sometimes obsessed by plants and the idea, because sometimes we have to justify ourselves, especially if we work with people like Zaha Hadid or David Chipperfield, and that landscape also got things, which are to do with plants and nature, which freaks out the architects. So that at least we have something specialized in which otherwise we have, of course, a lot of overlaps. Now, this was the idea of designing a small art installation. In fact, it was the result of winning an art competition for a very mysterious little garden. And in this garden, we were intrigued to put in all the world's most freaky plants in one glasshouse. So plants with smells of death or look like sexual organs. And we found a beautiful book. You should read it. It's called Against Nature. It's a novel by Huysman, one of the decadent French novelists of the 1880s. And in this book, every chapter, the main character is manically collecting items. And in one chapter, this guy is collecting plants which are real, but they look artificial. And we went to the Botanic Gardens library, checked all the names mentioned in these chapters, and there are real plants. So we really still want to put them in one glasshouse, all those weirdos. It didn't work out exactly like that, but it's still a strange little folly in which we experiment with the idea of light and shade, and it's kind of its only utility is it's kind of non-utility. It's like a little folly. So this is just about playing with the wonders of plants and the kind of layering and the sense of mystery. Another garden or little project we done in Chengdu. In fact, very good tutors from Plasma and Ground Lab, of course, did this fantastic project. We did a little minuscule interventions in what was called the Master Gardens. The organizers invited 9 landscape architects around the world and asked them to do a little intervention. We decided straight away, because we know this was the city of the terracotta warriors, to use terracotta as a material. If they got those warriors, they must have clay, and therefore that could be the project. And I did something naughty, because when all those 9 masters were invited to China, we were all kept in this swanky hotel in the middle of nowhere, in a kind of completely controlled environment. And I literally escaped for one afternoon, hired my own taxi, because I knew that there was this old pottery village in the mountains of 1,000 years of pottery history. So I went there, and I also went to a factory, a pan tile factory. And so in one afternoon, along my long visit, I had all the inspirations for this one little project. And the project is this little shrine. It's actually a shrine for one of the British plant hunters who, as you know, most of the Ghana plants in Great Britain, they all derive from China. And they all kind of acquired in this period of the end of the 19th century by guys called Wilson and Forrester. And they were like hyperactive squirrels collecting all those plants. You know, this guy alone introduced 5,000 new plants to Britain coming from China. So this shrine is a collection of his plants as a kind of tribute for this horticultural expo, what this project was part of. So it's a kind of little tribute to the British hyperactive plant hunting history. And funny enough, actually the Heart landscape was built quite good by the Chinese, and although it was a horticultural festival, they really were struggling quite a bit with the planting, although it came up quite remarkably during the expo itself, but it was a bit of an uphill struggle. Another recent project, a competition we won in Beijing for the linear park in the central business district. And here we played the game of, we were intrigued about the setting of the city of Beijing in its wider landscape. This kind of very gridded city, celestial city, north-south, the forbidden city in its center, and then the mountain range. We like the contrast and the dialogue which you find all through the in the history of Chinese landscape architecture. It's all about hills and water and the man-made and the nature. So we analyzed that the first ring of hills around Beijing is actually the same height of the new high-rise buildings there, about 500 meters high. And we like this kind of correlations and the dialogue between the natural skyline and the new emerging skyline. And very simple, the project is about this linear park in which we, on top of a sunken shopping mall, which was given in the brief, the idea of the shopping in the park was not us, but on top of that we're building this artificial mountain range, and they're just based on slices of big beams, you know, big spans, 45-meter spans, the highest are 60 meters high, but they are like slices, you know, it's like the graphs of the shares or the heartbeat, or in this case, the outlines of the mountain ridge. So standing on different angles for this structure, you will see it in different compositions now, from either very transparent or more like a mass. And of course you also will see it from below and from above. This is a big structure, it's hundreds of meters, it's about nearly 1,000 meters long. And we will say, we're waiting for the approval of the new mayor, the new appointed mayor in the city of Beijing. And in order to bring down the scale of the surrounding high-rise, we're planting this simple woodland of pine trees. And from below. And somewhere we're having this tribute of water in this kind of moon-reflecting pond. So if it's full moon, the full moon will be projected in this round pond. If it's the crescents, the new crescents of the moon, you will see that growing, so that it's ever-changing throughout the year and the seasons. Pottersville Park, mentioned by Ricardo, one of our small build projects here in London. For us, it was kind of interesting because it allows us to think about a more intensified, smaller type of space, the kind of pocket park. Here we had to reconcile a lot of different users, tourist workers, but also to provide neighborhood park experience. And here for the first time we started to work more with the use of herbaceous plants as a way of creating identity and character. The basic principle of the park is like providing a belvedere overlooking the skyline of the city of London. So it's a very simple space which can be used for events and spontaneous way of people to use as seating. So part of the urban fabric. The other part of the park becomes then slowly more romantic, and if you arrive more enclosed by the neighborhoods, it becomes this very over-the-top plants garden. Here we work together with Piet Oudolf, the same landscape architect who later did the High Line together with field operations in New York. But a really interesting guy. He's now about 65, but he's one of our best friends in the Netherlands. We often collaborate now with him. He's a master. He's a kind of an artist with plants, and to collaborate and to put that more in an architectural context. Also, most of his work was for private gardens, so trying to translate that feel into the public realm is what we really think is quite exciting. So this is unashamedly romantic and about intensified experience of nature, right bang in the city. And a way of planting which of course got highlights during the seasons, but also is still quite intriguing in the winter, where the architect of the plants, even the dead plants, still provides a sense of intrigue and mystery. And then a bit more upstream, Royal Festival Hall, one of our favorite buildings, modernistic building, Festival of Britain, done up by Alison Morrison. But intriguing for us is that this building is a box in a box. Of course, for acoustic reasons, the theatre is isolated from the outer box. The underground and railway lines are close by. But that creates this ambiguous situation that the in-between is actually also a public space. So you got public space within the envelope of the building, and the movement through the building and the different terraces, it's of course makes a very intriguing inside-outside relationship. So the landscape around the building we started to integrate more with the inside. This is before we started the project, a mean strip of grass, a slip road, a kind of dark underbelly, brutalist railing, and the otherwise elegant building. But what was intriguing is that we realized by doing the project is that the slight curve in the building by Leslie Martin is actually the same radius as the curve in the river bank at this location. So the architect was very well aware, not just plunking down this building, but making this dialogue in the first place. So all what we've done in this project is restoring that dialogue by making this slightly curved, elegant ways of steps, taking the grass out, taking the slip road out, making that public space, together with the architects providing new functions like the shops and restaurants in the underbelly, and suddenly it becomes quite a successful public space, which is not shouting for attention. You probably would not even realize what's happened there if you didn't know the situation before. So it's not a kind of marvel of a product, but we think it's kind of does do the trick in a kind of simple way, making an elegant relationship between building and the wider landscape. And these light columns are of course a kind of playful interpretation of some of the elements which were part of the Festival of Britain in the 1950s. The first instance, I didn't like those new canopies by Alison Morrison. I called them the ears of Prince Charles, like he's sticking out. But now I don't mind too much. At first, I really didn't like them. And this is the front of the building facing Waterloo, how it was, and how we just in a simple way made it more in a public event space. Quickly, some buildings with Zaha. It's kind of funny. Sometimes I can give whole lectures without showing the work we do with Zaha, because partly maybe because it's it's always you're working, of course, very much in the streamline of the Zaha team, so it's quite difficult to kind of really put our own on some of those projects. Although the better projects like the BMW factory is projects which we were there from the beginning, and in most cases we part of competitions with the Zaha team, and then at least Zaha is very loyal. If they win the competitions, they keep us on board. This is a difficult project in Glasgow. It's a difficult project because the site is quite isolated and will become part of a much bigger urban master plan, but at the moment it's the building is a bit lost in space. Although the whole movement of Zaha, it's the building is on a confluence of the River Calvin and the River Clyde. So the building tries to express that in its dynamic shape, the meeting of the two rivers. It's quite interesting. The best part of this project is the roof. You don't see it, of course. It also was very good before it was cladded. It was actually much more like Piranesi. It was fantastic. But anyway, here we go. And here, of course, we did the landscape around the building, which we tried to kind of, in a simple way, trying to make the transition between the wider landscape and that building. But I repeat, it's not totally satisfactory because of the. It's a bit like what I call nibbling around along the edges. You want to think and be in charge of the bigger overview to create a bigger sense of context. Another project we did as a collaboration was a school in Brixton, the Evelyn Grace Academy, which by surprise actually won the Sterling Prize, probably for party political reasons. Let the school win for once. Intriguing site, because the site is really cramped for this school. It's actually two schools combined in one. Normally we need about 8 hectares for a school like this. This was, maybe 2 hectares. And the school is one of the academies put sports very much on the program. So here the idea with the Zaha team, of course, was kind of make a playful little double use of space. And you got this is literally the only school I know in the whole world, but literally the children run to school to run into the classroom. So it's kind of fun. But it's also kind of dealing with this limited space, making 2 sides of entering the building. So it's actually quite doing a lot of tricks in one little scheme. Right, the final project like to show you, it's what we're doing right now in Berlin. After we do many projects in Berlin straight from the beginning of our practice in 1996. In fact, we discovered that if you paste all our competitions together, and if you compare it to this kind of mad axis of evil by Adolf Speer from the Reichstag down to the Potsdamer Platz and all the way down, we redesigned that whole axis by all the competitions we've done over the last 15 years. And we always were a runner-up or Ankauf award, etc. But last year we won the big competition for the Tempelhof Airport. I only showed this once in Germany, and then I kind of read it out of the script. But it's kind of intriguing because it's of course to do with the power of urbanism as a kind of political tool. And there's no doubt that our project is completely driven by politics and small-minded political ambitions trying to do big things. Nothing ever changed. Berlin is quite an interesting city because it's now quite a big city across a big territory, but for a long time it was quite a compact Baroque city with the old medieval town, the Baroque extension to Tiergarten, and then further away actual alignments to Potsdam where some of the royal palaces were. And talking about landscape urbanism, for us Berlin is one of those cities which is really interesting to analyze as an urbanized landscape. How the territory, it's still to be, you can still read the territory into this urban fabric. And even our site, which is that big open space, just compared to the Tiergarten, the biggest park in existing Berlin, you see this incredible void. It always has been an open space. It's called Tempelhof. It was the field of the Knight Templars who were trying to go on crusade to Jerusalem in medieval times. It then became always an open space because the geology made it very poor soil. It's quite exposed in this kind of geological kind of moraine landscape. And because it's this tough, not good for agriculture, quite exposed, it's always been open throughout its history. Military exercise fields and different kind of airports, first a civil airport and then a fascist military airport. Which is, of course, on one hand is fascist, but on the other hand is heroic. It's, during the Cold War, 1948, the Russians kind of blockaded all the land routes to Berlin, and you only can use this airport as a lifeline to fly in all the support. So the history is also got this kind of heroic lifeline called the Luftbrücke, the air bridge. So interesting to think of how we can create this new openness as a new public urban park. And the building itself is fascinating. It's one of the longest buildings facades in the entire world. I think it's the second largest continuous facade. It's 1.6 kilometers long as the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. Norman Foster called it the mother of all airports. So on one hand, yes, it's a fascist building. On the other hand, it's quite a constructivist building. It's got this ambiguous nature on both its facades. But this first is quite fascinating. I talked about Versailles, but if you walk to Versailles, you got on one hand a very urban plaza with this goose foot pattern of avenues. The building is quite is long, but quite shallow in its depths. And then if you are in the garden, it's like, wow. And the same experience is if you got here. If you go to the building and you see, wow, you got this incredible open space. There's a quote from Nietzsche which somehow disappeared in my PowerPoint, but it's about the beauty, about that people really need this kind of open voids in cities to expose to the elements. So the project is very much about, oh here it is actually, an interesting quote of Nietzsche about the need for this quiet, open, expansive places for contemplation. And it feels like that, you know, on this side you can see the rain, on one side the rain fall, and the other side the sun still shines. It's fantastic kind of, if it's snow in the city, it's really one big wide mirror. It's a great sense. We were very much also inspired by the film Wim Wenders, Himmel über Berlin, Wings of Desire in English, the idea of floating above the side, the idea of capturing the void, like this is the movement of a small aeroplane which draws the figures in the sky, very much the simple concept behind the whole scheme. So it's quite a simple profession I'm part of. Here, first working model, the idea of creating this orbit of dynamic lines on the periphery, which will contain the designed park elements, celebrating the void, more intense towards the airport building, and engraving with landform the scale of that building into the land itself. And this was fierce debate with the jury, because some people said, well, you were celebrating a fascist building and you couldn't do that. We said it's not true, it's two fingers up to the fascists, it's all about culture and excitement. It's a new people's park. The original master plan, which since then started to change since it becomes a real product, but it's the simple intent. Of course, using the hard surface of the runways, creating new north-south connections, but very much creating this constellation of the activated ring and connectivity with the surrounding urban landscapes. And the idea that the park on this scale, it's not so much about the park, but it's about what the park sits in the bigger urban landscape. So it's really, this of course playing, this used to be the control tower at Tempelhof, and here we use it to symbolize our green structure, which is like a Russian doll. It's a landscape in a landscape in a landscape. And especially Berlin is a very interesting city, where the city is, I mean, I joked about the ecological Taliban, which drives me crazy, but at the same time they also have some really interesting things about contemporary ecology, the idea of how climate and cold air moves and finds its way to the city fabric, and the role of parks like this into this kind of organism of the city, of cooling down the temperature in the city during the hot summer, etc. So yes, we very much started to look about how the park sits in that context, and started to make proposals, basically saying that you don't need to do much in the park as long as you make those connections, which allows kind of recreational connections, but also ecological and cultural connectivity. Of course, we bring in some things we come from Britain. You know, everything is done before, as I said. But Bath is a kind of interesting example of, on a different scale, but how this crescent scale building can hold the space, and how the land can find its way up to that. Here you see the landform is becoming more subtle, because I said in the beginning I like flatness, and the side is flat. However, it still falls away on this long distance, a couple of meters, by having a kind of vacant beginning of the landform, side away, having this kind of landform which remains horizontal but creates this three-dimensional relation to the actual airport building. This project is not so much about master planning and the grand figure. It's very much about process. It's a process which already started with what literally is called pioneer uses. It's very much what I said about pioneer urbanization allowing to grow to a climax urbanization. So these uses are already taking place in the periphery, and over time they will be embedded, and they will act as catalysts for some of the development on this orbit which we're going to create. So a lot of emphasis is not just design, it's about mapping this transformation process, both in terms of space, its program, and its natural development. This is what I really like to do, like Snoopy, you know, the Red Baron and Snoopy. And again, this is written out of the script. The client doesn't like me to show this any longer. But I thought this First World War is long forgotten. It's kind of less controversial. But I wanted to have in this plane doing the planting of the project, you know, like these little seed bombs. And then the whole idea is that the planting plan is in Jackson Pollock, you know, simple as that. It had a bit of fight with the ecological Taliban. But the idea was, this is Albrecht Dürer, of course, on the left. But the idea here, or big commentary here, is that we not always have to think about nature conservation. We literally can activate nature. So we use the word nature activation instead of nature conservation. Actively create nature. If nature is already beautiful, we can make it more beautiful. It's about perfecting nature. It's as simple as that, what landscape architecture is all about. Creating a kind of vegetation which is even more interesting for insects and bees and birds, etc. So it's not just say, let's protect what is there, but let's work and evolve like that. We work with Siddle and Hussey Architects for some of the structures and the pavilions in the park. Beehives inspired by old airport structures. And some transformation of existing airport kind of vocabulary. More traditional parks along that periphery. Pioneer woodlands, walking with the old broken up tarmac areas. Temporary flexible gardens on the concourse. A rooftop restaurant on the actual building as a kind of prime view onto the site. A big artwork, which again, reducing our budget, but we were talking with Ole Eilertsen, the Icelandic Danish artist, to collaborate on a big sky mirror, which will become a big ice rink, the largest ice rink probably in Europe, by simply flooding the meadow in this round circle in the winter. And this really caused outrage in the press. In fact, they only wrote about this instead of our design because we wanted to have at least one vertical element in this horizontal plane. And the whole city of Berlin is full of those monuments dedicated to war and victories. We want to have a monument as a tribute to Alexander von Humboldt, the German Darwin. And he's the guy who found out about plant geography and how plants relate to different height, altitudes in mountains. And so that is the inspiration for this kind of vertical structure, which is hollow on the inside and which allows us to create one of the most exciting climbing schools in Europe. And we did an economic study to make this worthwhile. And this is fantastic for me because it is really fun, because I found this only a couple of weeks ago on my local beach. And I thought, fuck the hell, look at that. That's even better as we could have in mind. So all I have to do now is three-dimensional with those scanners, so three-dimensional scanners, scan it in, get the cat drawing and build the bugger. It's survival of the quickest, not survival of the fittest. And I really like this, to find this little piece of rock on my beach and build it in Berlin will give me great pleasure. And finally, to make the link between somewhere in the beginning, I only recently put those one and one together, and somehow maybe we are still working in its old tradition of landscape. Thank you for your patience. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for the for the lecture, for this sort of like a flurry and sort of overwhelming amount of images, projects, ideas about landscape. Do we have any questions around the field? I see some known faces around. Do we have a microphone to see?
You mentioned your preference for the larger scale.
Yes.
And I was wondering, as landscape architect, it seems like those kinds of fields of expertise are often outsourced to, I mean, things like infrastructure engineers,
yes,
or urban planners, this sort of thing. So how do you see landscape architecture actually carving out its own niche of expertise or contributing to the conversation along that?
Sorry, I missed the last part of you.
Oh, so how do you see it carving out its own expertise or its own expert contribution to the conversation?
Well, I think of course we've got a history. We should not forget our own history. If you actually, the first origin of the word landscape architect instead of landscape gardener is very much like Olmsted, who designed Central Park. But after that, he also did things like the Emerald Necklace in Boston, which is a fantastic urban cleansing mechanism dealing with the whole drainage and the whole, this metabolism of the city of Boston in its time. So these are quintessential projects done on a large scale, already embedded in the history of our profession. And of course, my home country of the Netherlands, I don't have to defend the large scale in the Netherlands. It's completely ingrained into our world. Sometimes I say the Dutch can design landscape but cannot design gardens, and the British can design gardens but they cannot design landscape. So I think we've got a long tradition, and Germany is a good example as well. I like the idea about landscape urbanism as a new territory, especially because it's not landscape architecture, but it's indeed dealing more with the infrastructure and as a driver for the products. In fact, as external examiner at AA of that program, I always found those projects the most successful with dealing with the kind of infrastructure as the driver. But I like this idea that those projects move from truth scales, from the large scale down to the small scale. I'm a great believer in that. I think architecture has lost this capability to a certain extent. I think architects, take Le Corbusier, one of my maverick heroes, but those guys were zooming in, zooming out, walking from the scale of how to plant city to the building, and that's a kind of thing that has lost. This kind of architecture and urban planning has become kind of separated, only to be refound in rather more recent times. The territory and the topic of the territory, it's open ball game. I would never say this is for me as a landscape architect. That's the urbanist, landscape urbanist, the engineers all operating on that strategic scale. I think landscape architects should therefore be able, and that's what I try to say, and that's sometimes why I kind of embed myself in the tradition of my profession. I also think it's about the visual, it's also about art and those things, as well as the more environmental and engineering type of approach. So I think that's why landscape still has something to add, and landscape is a very old profession, and that's sometimes forgotten, as if we have to reinvent it. But it's we have done big projects, and one of the bigger projects, for example, we done in our office was a plan for the whole coastline of the Dead Sea. It's 250 kilometers long linear landscape. It's fantastic to really operate on that scale. It's my only disappointment is, as a small practice in this country, it's quite difficult because the whole idea of planning the landscape is kind of gone out of the window. Even planning of cities is gone out of the window. We've gone backwards in Britain compared to many other places, and it's interesting that now in those rapid places like China, the opportunity arises to work on that big landscape, and bloody hell they need it very much.
Very quiet.
One back there.
Hello. Hi. Just on the subject of planning, because you were, I mean, leading on from what you were just saying, that the planning is going out the window in the UK. I mean, they were saying this morning on Radio 4 that UK has probably the tightest planning system in the whole of Europe at present. Do you think there's any hope in the localism debate for landscape architecture and urban design and planning landscape on a bigger scale? Or do you think we have to wait for Labour to come back?
I don't know if I would agree with the word tight. I probably would call it uptight instead. The most uptight planning system of Europe. It's all become two-dimensional planning. It's like zoning. It's not proactive. It's not about division, especially not the third dimension of those visions. So I would not agree that I would agree that there's a long tradition has been evolved out of this country, including Sir Abercrombie, which I mentioned, etc. And the whole idea of greenbelts is at the time where at least big visionary ideas of urban things, but we never come out of that. I really believe we went backwards. I mean, the opportunities are there, and the need is there, and the agenda has changed. Of course, if you take the whole sustainability agenda, or the whole change in agriculture, or the impact of economic policies coming out of Europe having an effect on the landscape. I mean, this is of course old. Take the Enclosure Act in the 18th century, completely transformed the British landscape. So political decisions can of course filtering through in having a big impact, but. No, I think the planning system it's not geared up in this country to be proactive in planning. If I work in Holland for the government, for the city of Amsterdam, for example, or for the national government, you make plans. You not just leave the plans to private developers. The authorities and the national government make plans. The Holland got a national plan, which is always big pieces of debate and exhibitions and ongoing projects on the scale of the whole country with ecological networks, ecological infrastructure, etc. Those kind of things, at least in my practice, I found difficult to bring across in this country. It's difficult to operate, to find the jobs and the projects. I mean, the Dutch are maybe the opposite for it, and in Holland, everything is paper plan as well. In Holland, you can survive as an office by just making paper propositions, without building anything. In fact, the Dutch are getting quite bad in building things, but very good in imagining things.
Thank you.
You've mentioned the sustainability. Oh, sorry.
Maybe just one. I'm not sure how much this is related to personal thing, but you use the term nature, and I wonder how you use the term nature. For me, this is always a term which is almost a bit like the parents of misbehaving children, yes. Where if we take a break, the parents, that is nature, will mend it again. And if we think that there is no nature anymore, then suddenly we're grown up and we take responsibility for all that we're doing.
Yes.
So I wonder how you use the term nature.
Well, very much. I mean, in that sense, I'm an old Darwinist. I think nature, of course, includes human nature. So to make any artificial condition between the two, it's obsolete and absolutely not of no use. So we are nature. We are animals in their own right, but we have the capability to perfect nature. To a certain extent, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, often the nature we often have to put in a kind of cultural context. If I talked about nature as a kind of, the Italians were quite good in it. They had three definitions for nature. One was nature as wilderness. Another type of nature was more the nature of the man-made land of agriculture, and another kind of nature was the nature of the enchanted nature of the designed landscape. That was already in the Renaissance. So I agree with you that we should define nature, and we can give many definitions, and if we had more time, we should be more clear in the use. But it's too big a word to give one definition. We just have to put it in the context it's being used. Otherwise, it's like all those words, they become empty.
It has this somewhat sublime quality to it that it's just both unspoilable, but at the same time not.
Yeah.
It's unattainable as well, and as such, it just limits our field of interaction.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, if you kind of analyze some of our project, we of course have a certain kind of ironic approach in that. I mean, I think by exactly your question, we will maybe raised by how we think about some of our projects to make that across. What we don't like, what we really is a big fight in our profession is this cliche about nature. Nature is good. No, nature is horrible. Nature is cruel. Nature is pathological. It's all about death. It's all about once a botanist told me that a piece of grass in itself, it's a slaughterhouse. It's a battlefield. Survival of the fittest. So nature is not nice at all. It's quite, and I like that as well. So I like to kind of at least pick some holes about cliches about nature, and definitely we are part of nature. We're influencing nature, and we have to find a new equilibrium. I mean, it doesn't mean that I'm against. We in a funny way we work to quite several botanic gardens, and I find it fantastic to work with people who really understand the scientific underlying processes you can find in nature. It's a great source of inspiration. Also in terms of architecture, Darcy Thompson on the Growth and Form is one of my favorite books. So it's of course it's a resource. It's one of the things we play with nature.
I think you've touched on quite a lot of the issues. I mean, I was going to ask, but how do you see the role of, the discourse of sustainability impacting on the profession of landscape architecture? Because somehow, at least you seem to be defining nature from a cultural perspective right away, kind of like quite radical. But somehow, it just seems that sustainability is taking a lot of the energy out of landscape architecture discourse somehow, and kind of like blurring it into other disciplines. I don't know, what's your view on what's happening to the discipline on its own right, not just in your office, but in general?
Yeah, but to really talk about sustainability, we go right back about scale. It's for sustainability, we need really the large scale. We need the scale of cities, we need the scale of regional landscape, we need the scale of estuaries, of coastal landscape, etc. And we have to find ways. What is interesting, if you started to think about the ecology and as a kind of planning tool, it's a very good old professor in Harvard, Foreman, who writes about ecology. And if you read his books, it's about patchwork, it's about corridors. It's actually very geographic terminology, which you easily can borrow and superimpose on our projects in terms of landscape. So I think that organizational principles, the ideas of the static master plans, they are over. We are working in dynamic systems, and I think ecology and understanding ecology is all about understanding dynamic processes. So in that sense, I think it's very interesting as a topic. But I repeat, it's also a topic which is being hijacked by moralists, by certain political agendas which I'm not interested in. So I think it's like nature, sustainability. It's a heavily loaded term and often misused and leading to the wrong conclusion. So I'm always hesitant, and when I say ecological Taliban, I'm quite sure. In Germany, we are only used to use native plants. I made a joke in the airport project because I looked at climate change, and then the oak, of course, is the German native trees, and all the symbols even in the Nazi period. And I said, all right, we're going to plant oaks. But funny enough, we're looking to east, south, west, north. Now east, Turkish oak, south, Spanish oak, west, American oak. And we have celebrating the oak, but not longer the native oak, but using those new oaks to show that they are more adapted to the changing climate than the old traditional native oak. So the idea, the Germans in terms of the 1930s. I mean, and both communist as fascists, by the way, but they were obsessed by ecology and nature, the first nature reserves, really good ideas about sustainability, but in the idea of celebrating the Heimat, the home ground, and everything what was foreign, like Jewish or exotic plant, they should rouse, they should not be there. Well, you cannot do that any longer. You know, the world has become a bit more complex like that. So if Germans tell me only to use native plants, the alarm bell's going to ring. So in that sense, but what I'm really, and that's maybe my Dutch background or the Dutch arrogance or the Dutch pragmatism, is that you can create nature. You know, one of the biggest nature reserves in the Netherlands, it's Oostvaarderplassen. It's a couple of 100 hectares, or 1,000 hectares, I don't know. But it was allocated to become one of the biggest industrial areas in the Netherlands. That was planned for the long-term future. Because it's long-term future, you don't drain it as well as the urban areas because it's set-aside land. Completely unplanned, not the script of anybody. Nature took over, and in 25 years, it is now one of the biggest nature reserves in the Netherlands. It's the kind of airport for all the migrating birds between north and south. It's, you know, Heathrow Airport, Terminal 5 for the birdies. And it's fantastic, it's just spontaneous. But in this case, something man didn't do or tried to do. And those give me great inspiration. So sustainability is for me about making landscapes and perfecting landscape. And to give the real answer, that first little project I showed you by Darwin collaborating with rigour, you know, making an ecosystem, a non-existing ecosystem, instant ecology for a very clear purpose. And it works. It's not native plants. You know, true ecologists would be despise this because it's all exotic and mix them in a new man-made ecosystem. You know, that would be a crime in current day sustainability dialogue because it's not the pre-existing ecological landscape it used to be. It's something new. However, I think we can make landscapes, and sustainability is again an incredible tool, and therefore we have to know those things. And I think as a landscape architect, including a landscape urbanist, which is not the same as a landscape architect, still the understanding things like geology, hydrology, soil, biology, as a kind of interacting layer. If it's man then on top of that started to interact as well, that creates identity of place. And maybe a criticism about landscape urbanism that often is thinking too much about I'm making this up, I haven't thought about this before, but thinking too much about horizontal connections, you know, how it goes from A to B, like pilots go, or roads go, or railway lines. But I think real interesting landscape is about the vertical relations as well. That often creates sense of place, because certain soils and certain geology, certain hydrology lead to certain kind of man-made interventions, and therefore create a sense of place in an otherwise very generic world. So there's a kind of slight intriguing difference.
Okay. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Great, thanks for having me.